Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.
The International Day for the Eradication of Poverty is observed each year on October 17th. This day aims to foster understanding and dialogue between those living in poverty and the broader society. It serves as an opportunity to recognize the struggles of people in poverty, to give them a platform to voice their concerns, and acknowledge that they are often at the forefront of this fight against poverty. Established by the United Nations General Assembly on December 22, 1992, October 17th was designated as the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. The resolution calls on all member states to dedicate this day to activities that address and promote efforts toward eradicating poverty and destitution in their national contexts. This day highlights poverty as a complex issue that encompasses not only insufficient income but also a lack of essential capabilities for living with dignity, such as inadequate housing, insufficient nutrition, limited healthcare access, unsafe working conditions, unequal access to justice, and a lack of political power. Let us turn our attention to Nepal now, where Dev Kumar Sunuwar of the Sunuwar people will tell us how poverty is impacting the indigenous peoples of Nepal.
My name is Dev Kumar Sunuwar. I represent Sunuwar, Indigenous Peoples of Nepal. Sunuwar is one of the 59 indigenous peoples legally recognized by the government of Nepal. Indigenous peoples together make up like 35.2% of a total 30 million population in Nepal. Despite comprising a significant portion of the population, indigenous peoples in Nepal have historically faced discrimination and marginalizations. They have been excluded from key social, political, and economic processes, leading to systemic inequalities. Issues include the loss of land and access to natural resources, often due to development projects and the government policies that do not prioritize their rights or input. Indigenous communities also struggle with cultural preservation, as their languages and traditions are at risks of erosion amidst dominant national narratives. Furthermore, there are significant barriers to political representation and participation. Many indigenous groups lack a voice in decision-making processes, which hinders their ability to advocate for their rights and needs effectively. Access to education and healthcare remains limited, exacerbating the challenges they face in achieving social and economic well-being. Overall, the situation of indigenous peoples in Nepal highlights the urgent need for policies that recognize their rights, promote their inclusion, and support their efforts to preserve their identities and improve their living conditions.
The following is taken from ohchr.org, the website of the United Nations Human Rights High Commissioner. Quote, "The rights of indigenous peoples have been progressively given more attention by the UN system, yet indigenous peoples continue to be left behind and suffer disproportionately from climate change, environmental degradation, high levels of poverty, poor access to education, health, and broader human rights violations." While representing over 6% of the world's population, indigenous peoples are nearly 3 times as likely to be living in extreme poverty. They account for almost 19% of the extreme poor. Indigenous peoples have been particularly hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic and its socio-economic and cultural consequences. Globally, there is a lack of disaggregated data on indigenous peoples. Where data exists, the situation is concerning. End quote. And to bring us up to speed on the situation in Guatemala, Diana Pastor of the Maya Quiche people tells us how poverty is adversely affecting the indigenous peoples of her region.
My name is Diana Pastor. I am Maya Quiche from Guatemala, and I work for cultural survival. Guatemala is one of the most unequal countries in Latin America, with its indigenous population having been particularly affected by COVID-19. Indigenous groups, primarily Mayans, represent a huge percentage of the country's population. Among these communities, poverty rates soared to an average of 79%, with 35% experiencing food insecurity. Indigenous Guatemalans face significantly harsher living conditions than their non-indigenous counterparts. The country has a long history of Spanish colonial rule and has endured multiple conflicts. Despite having the largest economy in Central America, Guatemala holds the second highest poverty rate in the Americas, with indigenous individuals being disproportionately affected. Most indigenous laborers earn less than $5 a day, and a staggering 79% of them live in poverty, primarily in rural areas. Frequent droughts compound these challenges as many indigenous families rely on subsistence farming. Guatemala also has the highest rates of malnutrition in Latin America. 8 out of 10 indigenous children suffer from inadequate nutrition, compared to 4 out of 10 children nationally. This stark disparity highlights the urgent need for targeted interventions to address the socioeconomic inequalities faced by indigenous communities in Guatemala.
Would like to end this podcast with a reminder that Sustainable Development Goal number 1 aims to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. The 2030 Agenda acknowledges that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. For more on the rights of indigenous peoples, visit cs.org and follow Cultural Survival on Facebook and X.